Okay, good morning, everyone. So I hope you had a great spring break. So now we are almost toward the end of the second module. Okay, so this week and next week, so we will finish this module, and then the next week we are going to have our I believe the third midterm, right? So before I expand to you new material, let me just quickly summarize we have learned. Okay, otherwise you probably just forget. So what are we going to do? So in this module, we have covered two chapters. In lecture 9, so we look at aggregate relationships. So what we have learned in the previous chapter or previous lecture. So essentially, we look at C as a function of y. And we also look at I may change with I. Right? The reason why we look at these two things is because think about the total GDP. Okay, y equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. In a simplified word, so no NX, G is fixed, and then the GDP is going to be determined by C and I. So this is from demand side. Okay. And also we look at expenditure. Remember, we can look at GDP through three different angles: expenditure, essential spending, income. And the next, we can look at GDP by product. So that's the most native way to look at GDP. But we can also look at expenditure and income, right? And here we focus on demand. So this is quite useful for us to understand many current issues. Like, say, for example, last week, okay, I guess most of you already received a check from the Treasury Department. If not you, maybe your parents, right? Like our family, we got some checks from the Treasury. But then you may be wondering, so why the government want to do that? Okay, just besides some political motive, what is the economic reason behind the government decision to send pretty much most Americans $1,400 check? What is the economic reason behind that? Right? So this part and the next part of this class is going to help you to understand the economic reasoning behind those government policy. Right. Okay, so that's what we have learned in lecture 9. In lecture 10, so we build upon this aggregate relationship or macro relationships to study the first simple model that is going to help us to understand the level of GDP. Okay, so there's a question from the students: is the stimulus an example of monetary policy? Actually, so the stimulus we are experiencing right now is largely a physical policy, but certainly there are monetary aspects inside. So why it is a physical policy is because this works through change in tax, change in transfer, right? So essentially, this is a transfer from the government. Okay, or you can think about this is a negative tax. So in that sense, it is a good example of physical policy. But then the reason why I mentioned there's some monetary policy component inside is because so the money, so the source of the money, right? So the source of money then has something to do with the monetary authority or Federal Reserve. Okay, but for now, so you should understand this is a physical policy, right? Good question. So now here, yeah, so we understand the C and the I. So now we're going to realize on this one, maybe just erase everything, can rewrite. So now we have Y equal to C times Y plus I times Y, right? And then, so in principle, so there's one equation and one unknown. What is unknown? So we are going to look at Y. So basically, we are going to look at the determination of GDP from the angle of demand side. Okay, so that's just summarize what we have learned in lecture 10. Let me just quickly go through these slides, right? So we basically, in these slides, we look at income expenditure model, right? And in this income expenditure model, so essentially summarized right here, right? So aggregate expenditure planned equal to C plus I planned. Okay, but this aggregate expenditure, so that's going to give you Y, right? And C plus I also give you Y. Okay, and then look at this example. So there's one particular row, real GDP, okay, equal to planned aggregate expenditure, right? So if we are above this row, and what happened? So that means what we produce is going to be below what's going to be demanded. Okay, and then so the business is going to adjust by increase order or by expand. So it's moved to this direction. On the other hand, if we below this row, and then so what you produce is going to exceed what's going to be demand. And then so the business is going to adjust by reducing order. Like in loss of cost, I give you an example of Apple, right? Okay. And on the graph, so we have, let's just go to a graph. Right, so this is a graph, right? So we have aggregate expenditure, but it's planned. So it has C plus I planned. And then so we can decompose into A, this autonomous spending, MPC, marginal propensity to consume, GDP, but that just tells you your income, right? Because your consumption is going to depend on your disposable income and plus I. Okay, so this 45-degree line, it just helps us to determine the equilibrium. So along this 45-degree line, so real GDP equal to planned aggregate expenditure. Okay, then they cross each other, you can see, so this equation is going to hold. Right. So now what happens if we deviate from this point? So for example, we are here. So in some sense, we overestimate. Okay, so we produce too much, and then so we can see, so the demand is going to short of the supply, right? So the demand, if we just look at this line, is 2,300, right? So actually this coming from the earlier example. Okay, and then so there's a increase in inventory because so you produce too much, so you are going to get rid of your inventory or get rid of your stocks of goods and service at a slower pace. So you are going to accumulate additional inventory, right? Because those are unsold goods and service. So that's going to be a signal to the business. So you have produced too much. You have been too optimistic. So then you want to reduce your production. So then you move to this direction. Now, say for example, so you have been too pessimistic or your adjustment becomes too dramatic. Now we are here. So you produce 1,000. By looking at the same equation, so we find out the demand is going to be 1,400. Now the reverse is going to happen. So you can see, so you're going to running low of your inventory because demand is pretty strong. Okay, so you cannot satisfy the demand. So hence that's a signal. So you have been produced too little. So you're going to increase your order. So until we reach the middle point, we call it the Kensington's cross or the equilibrium GDP. At this point, you have no incentive to adjust. Okay. And we have looked at those examples, right? So I guess that just finish the discussion of this chapter. So now we are ready to look at. Okay, now we are ready to look at next chapter, right? So far, just a quick summary. Okay. Now let's look at lecture 11. Okay. So in this lecture, so we are going to relax some of the key assumptions we have made in previous lectures. Okay. So primarily, so we are going to relax the assumption that a price is fixed or interest rate is fixed, right? So remember in the previous chapter, so we said R is fixed. So essentially that's price. Okay, those are fixed. Okay. We are going to we just look at, given the price, how the economy is going to behave at an aggregate level. What we are going to do in this chapter, so we are going to look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Oh, by the way, so in the previous lecture, the other assumption we did is, so we are only focused on demand side. Okay, supply will passively meet with demand, right? So that's what we did in previous lecture. Now in this chapter, so we are going to bring demand and supply all together. And then certainly you're going to see, so the benefit of doing that is, so we are going to determine the price. Okay, but this is aggregate price, right? But certainly there's a flavor of the equilibrium we've seen in microeconomics, or what we review at the first module. So now this is a roadmap of this chapter. Okay, so that's going to conclude the third module, by the way. So this chapter. Okay, so we start with aggregate demand. Okay, but you're going to see this aggregate demand largely coming from the expenditure model, income expenditure model, we just conclude, right? And after that, so we're going to look at aggregate supply. Okay, and the key things in aggregate supply is going to be the sticky wage. Okay, so that's a very important concept in macroeconomics. And then when we look at aggregate supply, we are going to differentiate in short run and long run. Okay, with the discussion on these two concepts, we are ready to look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is going to help us to understand what determines GDP and what determines price level. Okay, so that's going to prepare us for the discussion of monetary policy and fiscal policy. So those are the policies designed to stabilize our aggregate economy. Like right now, so the government carries out massive stimulus plan. So the main point of that stimulus is to stabilize the economy. Otherwise, we are going to see a much deeper recession. Or in other words, we will see a larger unemployment. Okay, so that's going to hurt our economy. But certainly, everything comes at a cost. Meaning, so this stimulus brings us benefit, but there's some cost associated with that stimulus. Okay, so we will wait for the next module to understand the implications of those fiscal and monetary policy. But for now, we need to have a theory, or we need to have a model or framework that allows us to understand how the macroeconomy works and how government policy can change the movement of our macroeconomy. So that's the number one thing that we need to do. Okay, now let's start with aggregate demand. Oh, by the way, so after we have those theory of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, so that can help us to understand the questions like this. What caused recession? Why inflation high in some recession and not others? right? Okay. Okay, start with aggregate demand. Okay. So this is how the aggregate demand curve will look like. Okay, but in the following slides, I'm going to explain to you how we are going to derive this aggregate demand curve. So this aggregate demand curve, first of all, is show us the relationship between aggregate price level and the aggregate output. Okay, both are aggregates, right? So particularly aggregate price level. So this is just think about CPI, but usually this is a GDP deflator. Remember the difference between CPI and a GDP deflator. Okay, both are price indexes, but a GDP deflator includes a larger set of goods and service compared with CPI, right? And so this aggregate demand curve shows lower the price level, higher the aggregate demand, right? So the demand essentially is expenditure. On the other hand, higher the price level, and then the lower the aggregate demand. Right? So this is very similar to the demand curve we studied in microeconomics. Okay, but how we reach this point is slightly different. Okay. Now let's see how we get this aggregate demand curve. So we start with this equation because we look at demand, so we look at expenditure, right? So this is how we can calculate GDP by looking at the expenditure or by focusing on the demand side, right? So this includes consumption, investment, government spending, and then net export. Okay. So now we need to understand how each of those components can potentially respond to price change. Okay. For now, so probably we need to ignore G. So the government spending may not be very responsive to price level. Okay. Now let's see. So why does the rise in aggregate price level will affect CI and net export? And more specifically, so that's going to reduce each of those components. Okay. If we understand that, so naturally, so that just means we know the aggregate demand curve will downward slope. So there are two reasons. Reason number one, there's a wealth effect. So when the aggregate price level increase, that is going to lead to a lower purchasing power. Okay, just imagine if you have $100,000. Okay, if the price level, say for example, the house, the median price of a house in Omaha is 100K. And then so you are about to buy a modest house. Now, if the aggregate price level increase, say for example, double, and then with the same 100,000, so you cannot afford to buy a modest house because that's going to cost 200K instead of 100K. Nothing else changed, just the price. So this is a wealth effect. Higher price reduce your purchasing power. Now, you may not want to consume, right? Because you don't have enough money to spend because price increase. And then so you want to reduce your consumption, investment, and maybe the consumption of imported goods as well. And so this wealth effect. On the other hand, there is an interest rate effect. Price increase, and then the households may need to hold more money. Why? because they need more money to facilitate the transaction. Okay, and in the next module, so you will see. So here the money is in a broader sense, not only cash, maybe the money you put in your debit card, and the money you spent with your credit card, right? Or in other words, the money you're not put in investment, like a house, or maybe buying some stocks, right? So the higher price induce you to hold more cash or broader sense of money. Okay, so that's going to lead to less resource the society can use for investment. So that's going to lead to further rise in interest rate. So that's going to lead to a fall in investment and in consumer spending. Why is that? So let's just say, for example, investment, right? So interest rate increase, that just makes investment more expensive. Just think about mortgage, right? So the rising interest rate or rising in mortgage rate, so that is going to make purchasing a house more expensive, right? So that's going to reduce investment. Okay. So now with these two reasons, so we can look at the graph to understand why the aggregate demand curve is downward slope. Okay, so this is the income expenditure model we have learned in previous chapter, right? 45-degree line cross with aggregate expenditure line, so that's going to determine the equilibrium. Okay, and remember in the previous chapter, so this is a given price, so P is given. Okay. Now just imagine if the price level declines. And then the two reasons we just explained in previous previous slides. What are those two reasons? The wealth effect and the interest rate effect. So both effects will induce consumer to spend more. And in the graph, that just says the curve, so this curve will move up. Why they want to move up is because, so they just says, okay, so given my income, now because the lower price level, I want to spend more, I want to invest more. Okay, because of the wealth effect and the income effect, interest rate effect. Now, with this new aggregate expenditure curve cross the 45-degree line, what are we going to see? We are going to see a higher GDP. Okay, so we move from E1 to E2. We observe Y1 increase to Y2. But what is behind the move is P decrease. And then so from here, we can see if P decrease, then Y is going to increase. You can call Y star. So this Y or Y star corresponds to P. And from here, from this argument we just had, so it already indicates there is a positive, there is a negative relationship between aggregate price and total GDP, right? So actually, so we can look at this diagram. Okay, on the top, so this is since we just learned, right? So this aggregate expenditure, so this is the income expenditure model, right? And given the price level, so this is given by here, and given the price level, so you're going to find Y1. Let's go to here. So this is given. Now, if the price level falls, okay, so by the way, so this P1 corresponds to this line, P2 will correspond to this line. And why is that? It's because of the wealth and interest rate effect we just talked about. Okay. Now you can see, so P2 will generate a Y2. P1 gives us a Y1. So now we can put these two combination into the diagram in the bottom. Okay, and hence we have this dot and this dot. This two dot just tells us lower the price level, higher the aggregate demand. Higher the price level, and then lower the aggregate demand. Again, so the reason behind this is because the wealth effect and the interest rate effect. Okay, and here, so you may already smell some implications on policy, right? So then the central bank, what they can do is probably just affect the price level. Okay, so if they can affect the price level, so they can adjust aggregate demand, right? Okay, so this is how we derive this aggregate demand curve. Okay. Now in the next slides, we will learn what can cause this curve shift. Right? But similar to what we learned in microeconomics. So you might want to differentiate between move along the curve versus shift of the curve. And from here, you can clearly see, so the only things cause a move along the curve is the aggregate price level. If aggregate price level change, so we are going to move along the aggregate demand curve, right? So if this change, we are going to move along this curve. Now, we also need to understand what causes this curve to shift, right or left, right? So here are possible reasons or possible factors can cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. Okay. First, expectation. Okay. What are the expectations? Think about expectation of your income in the future. Think about expectation about the price level in the future, not today. Okay. And the next is wealth. Right? So if your wealth increase, either because the bull market in the stocks, right, or is a booming housing market, so that make you wealthier, make everybody wealthier. Okay, and then so you want to increase your consumption, right? And the third factor is the size of the existing stock of physical capital. So that is going to affect particular investment. Okay. Just imagine if currently most of the physical capital we have are in idle. Think about the COVID-19, so just force most of our business closed or partially open. Okay. In that case, so you would expect no one has the incentive to increase in investment because you haven't used your existing capital fully yet. Why you want to increase investment, right? So this is the third factor. Now, lastly, but not the least, so the government policy can affect the aggregate demand. Okay, like I start today's class mentioning, so the government sent us $1,400 of stimulus check. So that's a classical fiscal policy. Okay, so this check, so it's going to encourage you to go out and spend, but certainly, so depending on your MPC, right? So depending on your income level, your MPC is going to differ. But nevertheless, you may want to spend some out of this 1,400. So that's how fiscal policy can change. But then somebody else may argue, okay, so today the government send us a check, but eventually the government will find some revenue to pay the spending they have carried out today. So that means, so eventually, so we will face a higher tax rate because that's how the government is going to generate revenue to pay off the huge sum they spend today. And if that's your expectation, or if that is what's going to happen, so that's going to have negative impact on spending. Why? Because you worry about, so the high tax or tax spike in the future will reduce your disposable income. Right? Now, monetary policy work through the money supply, or in the easier way to understand is, so the central bank, which is Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, they can adjust the interest rate, right? So in practice, that just means, so whatever they do is going to have implications on the cost of borrowing for households, business. Okay? So for example, last year, so the mortgage rate declined to the lowest almost in history, right? And then, so we heard the housing market was in a very hot state, right? And the housing price increase and the transaction increase. Or in other words, so monetary policy affects the aggregate demand through the price, right? So those are the things can cause the aggregate demand curve to shift, either is to the left or to the right, okay? But nevertheless, that can cause the aggregate demand to change.
I have a quick question.
Yes, please.
So the monetary policy, I think in the book, it talks about like how they affect the amount of money that's like in the market. Is that just referring to the fact that like if interest rates are lower, people technically have more money to spend? Is that what that means?
This is a very, very good question. Okay, so a couple of things I want to emphasize. So let's go slowly, all right? But this is an excellent question. So you mentioned two things. One is, so the monetary policy may leaves, depending on what type of monetary policy, usually it's just going to change the money people have in hand. At the same time, so the monetary policy is going to change the interest rate, right? So the first things I want to emphasize is both are considered as monetary policy. And secondly, I want to emphasize, so in reality, so the way the central bank conduct monetary policy has changed quite significantly. And most of the textbook may not have time to adjust what had happened in reality. Okay, so this is the second point. Now go to the third point. So let me just explain so how the Federal Reserve Bank conduct monetary policy in modern day or like today. Okay, so literally what they do is they just change the interest rate. The commercial bank will lend to each other, or the interest rate the commercial bank can borrow from central bank. Okay. And so say, for example, if the commercial bank, let's just think about First National Bank of Omaha. Okay. If that bank, they can borrow at a lower rate, either from other commercial bank or from central bank. So that means they can expand their business, right? And usually the way they expand business is what? They can extend or initiate more mortgage, or give you more credit card or more credit to households, right? So in either case, that is going to make spending cheaper and easier for households and a business. So that is going to increase the aggregate demand. Okay, so I hope that answers your questions.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so by the way, so why not we take a few minutes break, and then so we can continue our discussion to aggregate supply, right?